So organizations like the NGOs, the World Health Organization, the dreaded IMF, these are all transnational institutions which have already brought into being a world of trade, connection, exchange and circulation on an everyday and quite dirty level through migration, a kind of cosmopolitanization. I know this is not a terribly good word to use in English, but I'm just translating it because it sounds wonderful and perfect in German. Cosmopolitanization, well, I won't go into it because even Professor Beck stumbles over the word he has invented. But the distinction is that with cosmopolitanization is different from the notion of the cosmopolitan that we have in its philosophical form and in its Kantian sense. For Kant, of course, the cosmopolitan is speculated on one of the larger and grander projects of humanity, the search for universal humanity through which we could, as it were, stave off wars and conflicts. But it is not that sort of idealized cosmopolitanism, that philosophical cosmopolitanism, which has been so rich and developed on the level of theory and ideas, that forms the starting point of the idea of cosmopolitanization. Cosmopolitanization starts from observing the empirical connections, the empirical actualities which are being produced and thrown up in the world of the dark migrations. So much so that we have also, alongside this, the rise of the non-Western modernities, the rise of the post-Western modernities, whatever phrase we might choose to use, which are quite outside the West and today interact with it and demand, as it were, new course for it. Are the Enlightenment values, the Enlightenment ideals that went with the European notion of modernity, the ones we have in mind still when we speak of Enlightenment from the East, when we speak of the light of Asia, when we speak of Enlightenment coming from South America, from Africa, and so on? Maybe we should think in trying to have the courage to think this problem of cosmopolitanization, we need to turn to a Greek thinker from the ancient classical world, Polybius, who was captured in Greece and taken away to Rome and lived for 17 years in exile in Rome, but during the period had a long time to study the first cosmopolitanization of the world, when Rome, Greece, Persia, India and China, the great ecumenic empires of the ancient world, produce the first notion of the universal humanity and a kind of set of cosmopolitan ideals, each one touched by its own particularity, each one touched by its own quirky history and cultural and ethnic and civilizational shape. But the notion of the ecumenic empires is an important one for us to bear in mind in thinking through contemporary cosmopolitanization. That the ecumenic empires clashed. Some have called it the graveyard of the first set of empires of human history. But the graveyard was to produce the ash, dare I say the volcanic ash, out of which emerges the notion of an interdependent, interconnected, interchanging kind of world. A field of power and possibilities is how one might think of the notion of the ecumenic field. Instigation 3, or C. Do we have the courage to think what is creativity today? This very old-fashioned word, which was banned from cultural studies over the last 30 years, this word creation, authenticity, genius, inspiration, are all making some sort of comeback. What is the nature of this comeback? And I was hoping that we might think of it from the point of view of the description of today's world as a world in which creativity is claimed by almost every source you could think of. We are in a world of what I call pan-creativity. And in this pan-creative world, food has become a creative activity, preparing one's food. You cannot anymore just simply gulp a sandwich. You have Jamie Oliver in instigating you and inspiring you to think of it as a creative event. Tourism is no more volume and mass tourism. It is something that is bespoke tourism, which is crafted and, as it were, created by you as a creative person who makes a creative journey to Peru or to India or to China. Decor, the world of crafts, the world of knitting, the world of stitching, all these elements that were once devalued as feminized and therefore unimportant domains of knowledge are being reconstructed as creative activities. And of course, it is in this domain of pan-creativity that curating itself enters the arena as the new creative practice in the contemporary disciplines. Some might say no, but it has always been there, and I think one would have to draw a distinction between the conservatory notion of curating and the contemporary notion of creative curating. I think Goldsmiths College, which often doesn't get things terribly right, did get something right in calling the course creative curating, as opposed to critical curating, you might say, at the Royal College. I don't know, but let's not be too polemical. The notion of pan-creativity asks us also to look at the fact that once we spoke of the culture industries, Adorno and Horkheimer's famous dialectic of enlightenment spoke of the culture industries in a critical, in a negative way, that culture was being industrialized, that it was becoming a branch of the consumer industry. However, very soon that term becomes normalized in the rise of the financial capital world. We begin to speak of culture industries as though they were quite normal branches of the general industry. And then in a third step, there is no hint of irony by the 1980s in the use of the term the culture industries. And in fact, by the 1990s and 2000, we speak of the creative industries. And here again, the great challenge that is put, though we lose the sense of the negative dialectic and the critical that Adorno had put round this, we arrive at the area where we have to ask, well, if everything becomes creative, where there is this pan-creativity, what value or how is the creativity of art practice to be defined? Is it still a special and differentiated space of creativity, or is it now one amongst the many claimants to the ground of creativity? How would we deal with this? In the heart of Marx's draft notes for Das Kapital, in the draft notes, the Grundrisse, we find an extremely